Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for coming. I'd like to say at the very beginning that despite how I'm usually characterized, I'm not actually a technology skeptic. I don't think that it's technology that I'm skeptical about or pessimistic about. I'm extremely concerned about the direction in which our democracy and the politics are actually heading, and the role that technology, the private sector, and Silicon Valley are playing in this process. So I'll talk about the phenomenon I call solutionism, which is, to me, this tendency that we see increasingly in the Western world, particularly among our political elites, to expect too much from technology and to expect too much, particularly from Silicon Valley, and to think about problems through a new lens. And that lens, I think, is the lens of the app. We want to build apps that can fix everything. We want an app for problems that we previously used to tackle through politics. We want apps to fix education. We want to fix apps to fix health. We want apps to fix climate change. We want apps to fix all the problems that we are unable to tackle collectively. And while I think that there is much good that can come out from technology and innovation, this way of solving problems through apps does have significant political consequences. And I think we have to think about them before we embark on this quest to essentially apply this logic of commercial innovation to attack problems that so far have been tackled very differently and very often through non-market logics. And I think we have to understand that the reason why there is such a desire and such thirst for these new modes of doing politics that rely on apps has also much to do with our inability to do anything about the structural causes of the problems we find ourselves in. And those structural causes are probably well known to most of you. They have to do with the outsized role that corporations play in politics, that lobbyists play in politics, that our politicians are unable to deliver on the programs that we elect them to do. And it's quite obvious that given the structural constraints, so much is expected from technology. So much is expected of citizens as well, because every problem that you tackle through an app, in one way or another, delegates responsibility for the problem at hand to the citizen. Right? We are losing the ability to tackle problems like health, for example, obesity in America, by talking about ways to regulate food companies. Instead, what we are doing is that we are encouraging individuals to pursue their own health and take it into their own hands and to monitor everything they do, including exercise and food and everything else. That might be a fine solution, but it's not the only solution. Right? We still have to do something about regulating the power of the food industry. We have to do something about the power of lobbyists. We have to do things that cannot be tackled by apps. And my fear is that there is a very good reason why we are seeing the emergence of these highly privatized, market-based solutions that work at the level of the citizen and don't work at the level of the collective. We are losing the ability to talk about things at the level of the collective. We don't see problems as social problems. We see problems primarily more and more as failures of individuals to do the right thing. That's why so much is expected of smart technology. So much is expected of sensors that can monitor everything we do and tell us that we ought to be doing things differently. That, I think, is a very poor and unimaginative way of doing politics. I think even worse, what we are seeing are political systems that aren't with so much data and aren't with so much sensors and aren't with so many databases, have found ways in which they can continue optimizing the logic on which they run without posing any questions about how they ought to be reformed. Just to give an example, you should think about how, for example, the American government is fighting terrorism. How are we fighting terrorism today in a country like Yemen? What we do is that we are essentially relying on information signals, whether they come from cell phones, whether they come from blogs, whether they come from social media, to identify the most dangerous kids in Yemen who might one day blow up an American airplane. And what we do is that we sort them out based on how likely they are to engage in an act of terror, and we prevent them from boarding our planes. We're not asking big structural questions about why kids in Yemen actually get radicalized. And if we did ask that question, we might actually discover that one of the reasons for their radicalization has to do with the use of drones by America to go after their families. And that's a valid question that should be up for debate in our policy, and it isn't. And it isn't in part because we have so much data through which we can optimize the current system, instead of asking questions about what might be wrong with it. That, I argue, is the logic that we see at work in many other domains of life. As we get the ability to optimize the system by delegating more responsibility to citizens, we are losing the ability to ask big structural questions about how we ought to reform the world. And that bothers me quite a bit. You can actually see that logic at work in how we are addressing many of the problems revealed by Snowden. What we're seeing right now are, on the one hand, a push from the technology community, much of it by the benevolent, well-meaning hackers, to build tools through which we as citizens can protect our privacy. Well, the problem with that approach is that, of course, it does commodify privacy that used to be available to most of us for free. We are encouraged to download, exploit, and explore tools that will provide us the kind of security that was offered to us by default just 20 years ago. We are encouraged to learn how those tools work by paying consultants and security experts. All of that might be one of the many responses that we ought to mount, but this is just one response that ought not become our default solution to the crisis. On the other hand, what we are seeing are responses from the governments which do not want to tackle many of the big structural issues that have to do with surveillance and privacy. All of the solutions that have been proposed by politicians in Europe, I think, are not imaginative enough. What we are seeing are calls to build the Schengen Cloud or the Bürger Cloud here in Germany. Many of these proposals seek to replace infrastructure for surveillance that is made in America with the same infrastructure for surveillance that is made in Europe, essentially delegating the responsibilities that are currently carried by American technologists and American security agencies to their European counterparts. I don't think that that's the right response that we ought to mount. We have to figure out a much more radical strategy that will do something other than just shift responsibility for provision of cloud services from American providers to European telecom incumbents. We have to figure out another strategy that might not rely on centralized commercial model and might experiment with a different one. Otherwise, I'm afraid we will end up with the same system, only now it will carry the European brand instead of the American one. And that's not a good structural response to the crisis. And I think the paucity of thinking in Europe that we have seen in the last 7 or 8 months on this issue is actually terrifying. We are not addressing many of the core issues that were revealed by Snowden, many of them having to do with the transformations in how modern capitalism functions. And I think to most of you who spend any time thinking about technology and money, it becomes obvious that in one way or another, we are seeing personal information and personal data emerge as a new mode of payment for both goods and services that we receive. You already see it with basic communication services like Gmail. You already see it with personalized e-readers, which actually cost less if you accept advertising on them. I gather that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will see the same model spread to virtually all household devices that are equipped with sensors and internet connectivity. You would be able to receive significant discounts, actually get them for free, as long as you're willing to use the data that you generate in the context of their use as payment for the device. So for me, it's obvious that in 5 or 10 years, half of the households in your house will actually be subsidized according to that model. And I'm not sure that it's a very healthy development, in part because what we are seeing is companies in Silicon Valley that used to be very benevolent, that always marketed themselves as in the business of organizing all of the world's knowledge and doing all of those great things that we respect them for, moving into areas that are far less benevolent and noble. You may have seen Google moving into military robotics, but I think there are many other areas where these companies would move. And I think one of them, that again would be obvious to those of you who deal with technology and money, would be finance. I think that in 10 years, we would see both Google and Facebook in one way or another present in the banking industry and in the insurance industry for a very simple reason that they have the best data, much better than the banks, to assess your potential to repay the loans and also your potential for getting into accidents. With Google sucking in data from self-driving cars, thermostats, smoke detectors, smart glasses, email, and smartphones, it stands in a much better position than anyone else to be the super insurance company or the super banking company that the world has ever seen. And with Google's entry into providing debit cards, I think you actually see the first signs of that actually happening in reality already. If that's the scenario that we are looking at in the next 7 to 10 years, I think we should be much more careful about how we read and interpret current developments. I think while most of us don't mind Google having control over a smoke detector or thermostat in our bedroom, we wouldn't want JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs or any of the insurance companies having that type of control over what we do. But I think the reality that we have to acknowledge is that this is where these companies are heading. They're not going to sit on that data and use it to predict the end of poverty or use it for benevolent purposes that have nothing to do with the best way to make money, which is banking and finance. Right? And I think that's the reality that we have to deal with, and we have to think ahead about ways in which we can politicize and we can actually introduce more ethical dimensions to how we use data. I think we have to figure out ways in which we can find goals and dimensions other than growth that will indicate where the information economy should be going. And I'm very serious where I'm saying that we have to figure out what an alternative paradigm to growth can be in information economy. It could be privacy, it could be some ability to flourish as an individual, it could be something else, but we have to figure out how we ought to think about data exchange in an environment where your iPhone or smartphone will soon have an app that will be trading your personal information as it's being generated. And I think this is, again, the future to which we are slowly careening. I mean, you'll eventually be able to have an app on your phone that will trade your data in real time in order for you to receive some benefits or to actually receive monetary value depending on where you are and what you do. I can assure you that there is a company somewhere interested in knowing every particular action that you take during the day. You might not be able to understand why anyone would be interested in knowing how long you keep the refrigerator door open in the morning when you reach for your milk bottle. But I'm pretty sure that there is somebody interested in that data, perhaps the manufacturer of the milk bottle. Right? And they will be able to get that data as long as your refrigerator has a sensor and internet connectivity. From that perspective, what we are now seeing described as the Internet of Things and the smart home is just an extension of the same logic that we have seen in the last 10 years. And that's the proliferation of sensors and internet connectivity into everything with a view of essentially creating and establishing markets around everything based on personal data. And I think that if this is the environment in which we will find ourselves in 5 or 10 years, we have to figure out how each of us individually, but also how each of us politically as a collective would address these issues. And it might be that if we are given an option, whether we want to use personalized search to find a pizza restaurant in 5 seconds or 10 seconds, it might be that we'll go for the 10-second option because we know that that's the option that will actually preserve democracy alive. And I know that what I'm saying might seem trivial, but that's the kind of choice we face every day now with energy. By choosing to drive a car that is smaller than the car we can afford, or by choosing not to turn the lights on even if we can pay for electricity in our house. We have to articulate a different logic that has nothing to do with the value of information. It has everything to do with the value that information plays in democracy in order to be able to preserve it from the kind of solutionist trends that I see unfolding in Silicon Valley and in our national capitals. I think we exactly have 5 minutes for Q&A, so I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
So you've articulated some serious problems. What's the agenda for solving them? Like, how do you want to do political action, but how will, let's hear a scenario for how do you take action when 4 companies control everything to right?
I mean, the agenda is in many layers. I mean, some of it has to do with, as I said, articulating a different paradigm where you can actually incorporate values and goals other than just efficiency into how you think about information. I think there are many other dimensions, and it's showing, for example, how decisions that we take to be purely technological actually not at all technological. So when many of the things we hear at conferences like this are presented to us as just about innovation or disruption, entrepreneurship, I think it's our task to be able to see through those statements and figure out those are also statements about politics, those are also statements about economics, and that anyone who wants to build an app to save the world ought to justify that in terms that are not just about having good intentions. We have seen plenty of people with good intentions who've caused a lot of damage because of their very naive outlook on life, right? And so we have to figure out discursively, how do we move from a language and from a paradigm where everything that is controversial is presented as just a natural extension of technology or innovation, and that in itself depoliticizes it. So for me, problems start much earlier than I think your question implies. It's not just about the lack of political power, the lack of a social movement. It's the way in which many of the issues that ought to be subject for political debate are converted into paradigms that are purely about economics and efficiency, and they ought not to be. And from there, you can actually figure out what's ought to be done. And so many of the social movements we've seen so far, be it the Pirate Party in Germany or elsewhere, didn't start from there. And they thought that they can just start with slogans like, let's just promote internet freedom, open internet, without realizing that internet freedom means a very different thing to European telecoms in Brussels and their lobbyists than it does to hackers in Berlin. And once you start operating with such ambiguous slogans without linking them to some broader political agenda that actually is savvy about democracy, you end up in a pretty bad situation, as we actually have seen with the case of the pirates. But a social movement cannot exist without an alternative paradigm, and it's the paradigm that we currently miss. The Snowden has provided a lot of outrage, but we need to figure out what to do with that outrage. And it cannot certainly be just building more tools and passing data protection laws when everyone is interested in recording and storing and sharing their own data because it has become the new currency. But tools for protecting your data are not going to help when the incentives are for you to disclose it. There is nothing else, then we can wrap it up.
You use the word "we" a lot. Mm-hmm. Who would you describe that "we" as being, other than people? Do you have a specific image of a group that would?
Sure.
Who would they be?
Well, but the destruction of the we, I think, is the primary premise of the libertarian project that Silicon Valley wants to impose on us. And it's the idea that we all exist as consumers without any common project, be it health, be it education, be it something else. And that's just not the project that I refuse to subscribe to. So in that sense, we is the community of people who, have a shared interest in keeping political power of companies and others in check.
So you see it as a political, my mic on? Sorry. Are you talking a political, something like Occupy Wall Street kind of thing, or actual political? You mentioned Pirate Party as an example.
Sure.
How do you see that? What would be the vehicle for this kind of change?
Well, the vehicle for this, again, would be I think that what we miss is not the fact that we don't have the institutional formats to push for this change. What we miss is the intellectual agenda as to what's ought to be done and what we need to do beyond just passing more laws and building more tools. Once we have that intellectual agenda, the institutional vehicles for this are pretty clear. I mean, you can go through the usual route and putting people into parliament. You can go through another route of just, protesting in the streets. Or you can start working with currently radicalized movements like Anonymous and figure out how you can actually channel some of the outrage into projects that will deliver tools that will decentralize some of the current infrastructure.
But this is very abstract. You're talking about an intellectual agenda. Somebody should do something. What do you personally want to lead something to make happen? What's your specific, concrete agenda?
Well, my specific agenda is to articulate, again, the things that a lot of people writing for technology media would want to suppress, which is the inherent political nature of many of the tools that are presented to us as purely entrepreneurial and innovative. That's why, I have no problem picking up a particular tool, be it a smart trash can or an app for a smartphone, and pointing out the many ways in which it's deeply political, and it does promote a certain political and economic agenda, and it's not just about empowerment of the individual, which is the dominant paradigms through which venture capitalists and people building those tools would like to present them to us. And I have a long track record pointing out to those tools and apps and specifying in very fine detail what those are, including naming names. It's negative precisely because there is a lot of evil around, and we need to fight it. The idea of evil hasn't become obsolete with the invention of the iPhone.
Would you go so far as to suggest we should just all throw away our phones? I mean, that would be a nice way to start.
No, we should throw away our venture capitalists.
But why not just throw away the phone?
Because phones are not the problem.
No, it's a bugging device.
Technology is not the problem. That's why I started by saying that it's not technology that I'm skeptical about. It's the current configuration of political and economic power and venture capital. That's the problem. Problem is not in screens. It's not in devices. And it's precisely people who are on the other end who try to frame it as a problem of technophobes versus Luddites. It's not that problem. That problem is gone. It's all a matter of money and economics now. You have to argue on that field. Have you done? Okay. Thank you.